Hi, everyone. I would like to first thank Faye and Laura for having this paper on the program, and it's great to be here. And this paper is joint work with Roni Michaeli and Silvina Rubio, and Silvina is attending online. And we're very looking forward to your comments and questions and the discussion as well. So today I'm going to talk about institutional investors' role in corporate governance. So I guess in this room, I don't really have to emphasize how important shareholder voting and meetings are. And given that institutional investors own more than 70% of publicly traded companies in the US, it is really important to understand what makes institutional investors for or against proposals. So while the literature has made a lot of progress in understanding the determinants of institutional investors' voting decisions, votes are inherently binary. So they're either for or against, and they don't come with explicit explanation. So what we typically do is make indirect inferences based on the voting patterns, and then we relate those voting patterns to the characteristics of firms, investors, and proposals. So while we learn a lot from this analysis, we still don't understand the ultimate reason behind each vote. So for example, if an institutional investor voted against the director nominee, it can be related to the nominee's candidacy, but it can also be related to the broader concern about the company, or the investor might not like the fact that the company has no policy regarding sustainability. So although regression analysis can help us disentangle some different hypotheses, sometimes there might be factors that are important to institutional investors that are not aware to researchers. And sometimes researchers might have some clue on what's important, but they might not have the right proxy to test this idea. So it's really difficult to understand the reasoning behind the vote. So in this paper, we're going to leverage new data on voting rationale and study why institutional investors vote the way they vote. So for example, here are some examples of rationale. So the first example here says that the reason for vote against director is lack of diversity. And the second example says that the reason for opposing director is director busyness. So as you can see from these examples, rationales are vote specific. So they have the potential to uncover the reasoning behind the voting decisions. And we have nearly 1 million voting rationales in our sample, and we have more than 700,000 rationales on director elections. And in this paper, we're going to focus on uncontested director election because of its importance and also frequency. So first of all, we have to separate the rationales by proposal type, because different rationales are, different proposals type have different rationales. So we would see this type of rationale for director election proposals, but they're not going to be used for shareholder proposals and vice versa. So as directors are representative of shareholders, votes on director elections can hold directors accountable for their actions and company policy. And votes on director elections account for about 73% of votes in our sample. So this is the most straightforward sample for analysis. So using this novel data on voting rationales, we're going to ask three main questions in the paper. So first question is, what are the main reasons for votes in director elections? And with the new data, we're able to provide the most direct evidence up to date. And then we're going to quantify the relative importance of each reason. And next, we're going to ask whether rationales contain any information. So in particular, we're going to ask whether the rationales tell something about the company's characteristics, or whether it's just rationale washing, where we define rationale washing as an attempt to project a particular narrative or image. And finally, we're going to see if rationales have any impact on firms. And here we cannot draw a causal conclusion here, but our evidence is consistent with the view that firms address concerns that are stated in voting rationales. And we also find that addressing these concerns are associated with lower dissent in the following year. So regarding the main reason for votes in director elections, we show that the main reason for votes against directors are lack of board diversity and independence. So these are the two most important reasons for votes against. And regarding the reasons for votes in favor, we find that the rationales for vote in favor do not contain significant information. So a lot of the time we see a rationale like a vote for the director nominee is warranted, essentially containing no information. And regarding the question on what's the substance behind the voting rationale, we find that the rationales are well grounded on the aggregate, so they reflect something about the companies. So for example, companies with low board gender diversity would hear more complaints about board diversity. And we find similar patterns for independence, tenure, director busyness, and CEO duality as well. And regarding whether stated rationales are consistent with the voting behavior, we find that investors who frequently mention board diversity in their rationale, they're actually more likely to vote against directors in less gender diverse board. And we also find similar effects for tenure, busyness, and CEO duality as well. And regarding whether there's any impact of rationales, our results are consistent with the view that companies address concerns stated in rationale, and addressing concern is associated with lower dissent. So these are our data sources. The most important information comes from Diligent, and other data are from standard data sources. And our sample period is from 2014 to 2022 proxy season. And we have more than 34 million votes in our sample. And we have more than 1 million votes with rationales, and more than 700,000 votes votes on director elections have rationales. And while most of the studies in the literature focus on US mutual funds, our sample also includes pension funds as well as non-US investors as well. And because the data on voting rationale is new to the literature, one of our goals is to provide some descriptive evidence on the data on voting rationale. And here we're showing you some pattern on the time series pattern of the fraction of votes with rationale and the number of institutional investors that have provided at least one rationale. So although only a small fraction of investors provide rationales, there's a traction here. So during the 2002 proxy season, about 12.5% of institutional investors provided at least one voting rationale. And to briefly touch on the institutional background, because a lot of the institutional investors hold diversified portfolio, it's not going to make sense for them to engage with each and every company in their portfolio. So in this context, voting rationale can become a relatively low-cost strategy to communicate the reasoning behind their votes. And the disclosure of voting rationale is voluntary. And the UNPRI recommends their signatories to disclose so that the stakeholders can understand why a decision is being taken. And the largest investors in our sample vote on more than 100,000 proposals in a given year. So it means that it's going to be very costly for them to disclose votes for all the proposals. So the UNPRI recommends that signatories to prioritize disclosure under certain circumstances. For example, when investors are voting against the recommendation of management. So we try to explore whether disclosure varies by investor, proposal, and firm characteristics. And the most notable pattern here is that there's more rationale when the vote is against the recommendation of management. So for the director election sample we study, about 14.5% of votes against have rationale, but only 1.7% of votes in favor have rationales. And perhaps surprisingly, we don't find firm characteristics or firm performance being an important determinant of disclosure. And we don't find there being more disclosure during the non-busy proxy season as well. And after looking at the data, our conclusion so far is that the disclosure is like an institutional policy. It's not like a vote decision. So if an institutional investor decides to disclose only when they vote against management, then we see consistent pattern over and over time. So now I'm going to go back to our main sample, which is the vote on director elections. So here our goal is to understand what are the main reasons for votes in director election. And for this, we need to group rationales into different categories, making sure that similar reasoning belong to the same category. And I'm going to use the term categorized or classified during the presentation for convenience. And because we have a large number of unique rationales in the sample, we have to rely on some natural language processing technique. And we rely on supervised machine learning. And what this means is that we need to manually classify a random sample of rationales. And then after we do this, the machine is going to learn from what we did and then classify the entire rationale in our sample. So we randomly select 2% of unique rationales. And then we create categories after reading these rationales. So these 12 categories are independence, board diversity, tenure, busyness, and so on. And in creating these categories, we are inspired by the literature, but we also consider frequency and also the content of rationale as well. So for example, although there's a large literature on proxy advisors, we don't see a lot of rationales mentioning proxy advisors, so we couldn't create a category for those. And after we created these categories, we read through these unique rationales, and then two of the authors classified their rationale. And after this human part, then the machine is going to learn from our classified example, and then we use the BERT algorithm for this. So these are the performance metrics that are frequently used in the machine learning literature. And all of the performance metrics are above 95%. So we believe that we can accurately identify the main reasons for votes in director elections. So now let me show you what are the main reasons for votes in director elections. So here I'm starting with the reasons for votes against directors. And this figure is showing you the relative importance of each category. And this is at the meeting level, not at the director level. And as you can see from this figure, the most important, most common concern when voting against director is board independence. So this means that institutional investors have continuously put pressure on companies to increase independence, even after SOX required the majority of vote to be independent. And our proxy for independence not only captures director independence, but it also captures lead director independence and committee independence as well. And the second most important reason for votes against director is board diversity. And we believe that this is a meaningful finding, given that earlier literature on votes in director election, they do not identify board diversity as a main concern. And although some of you might think that this is a recent concern, we see this concern appearing as early as 2014, which is the beginning of our sample period. And some of the concerns such as tenure, busyness, responsiveness, attendance, these are the concerns that have been identified in the literature as important determinant on director elections. However, we are first to provide the relative importance of each reason. So for example, we find that tenure and busyness are some of the most important concerns, whereas responsiveness and attendance are not so important for institutional investors. And lastly, we also find that investors have been holding directors accountable for failure to address ESG and CSR concerns. And you can see this in the time series trend here. So the ESG CSR is in red, and it's becoming a more visible concern during the later half of the sample period, although it's still not a big concern. And here you'll notice that there's not much notable time series change. If anything, the importance on independence, which is in orange, is decreasing a little bit over time. And the importance weight on board diversity is increasing in the later half of the sample period. But overall, there's not a dramatic time series change. And this is going to be a little bit different if we break this down by different types of institutional investors. But overall, there's no time series pattern here. And because the rationales, like the disclosure of rationale is voluntary, you might wonder whether we're capturing specific investors' preference. So there can be over or under representation of a certain type of investors' rationale. So we use the propensity score weighting to refine our estimates. And although the numbers change a little bit, the relative importance of each category doesn't change dramatically. So next, we study what are the reasons for votes in support of directors. And first of all, investors are less likely to provide rationale when they vote in favor of directors. And even when they provide rationales, the rationales lack significant information. So the no reason category accounts for 29% of rationales. And the next common category is cautionary vote, where the rationales actually mention concerns, not reason for support. So that's the second most common category. And these two categories account for more than half of the rationale. And there are some informative rationales such as independence, board diversity, and tenure. So these are satisfactory independence, board diversity, and tenure. However, they don't appear that frequently in the random sample. So this is causing a little bit of a problem for our algorithm to accurately identify these rationale in the sample. So given the lack of information and the lukewarm algorithm performance, from now on, we're going to mainly focus on the rationale for votes against directors. So at this point, you might be wondering whether we are mainly capturing proxy advisors' rationale. So to study proxy advisors' rationale, we look at the robo-voters' rationale. And we have some good reason to believe that these are actually the proxy advisors' rationale. However, their rationale, the robo-voters' rationale, are very different from the rationales in the full sample. So for example, some of the most important concern in the full sample, such as board diversity, tenure, and CEO duality, these don't appear frequently in the robo-voters' rationale. So we conclude that the rationales in our sample are mostly institutional investors' independent assessment. And in the later part of the analysis, we exclude the robo-voters rationale, and all of our results remain the same when you exclude the robo-voters rationale. And next, we study whether there's any heterogeneity in different institutional investors' rationale. And the overarching pattern is that there's some agreement on some issues, such as independence. Everyone's believed that independence is an important reason. However, there's more heterogeneity along other dimensions, such as diversity. So now let me talk about whether there are any information contained in the voting rationale. So given the heterogeneity, you might wonder if this is just a collection of idiosyncratic opinions or whether there's some wisdom of the crowd. So in particular, we want to understand whether rationales reflect companies' governance weaknesses. So to test this idea, we create a variable called proportion of rationales for independence, board diversity, tenure, busyness, and CEO duality, and these are at the firm level. So for example, if investor A mentioned board diversity, tenure, and ESG concerns, and investor B mentioned diversity and busyness, then the proportion of rationale for board diversity would be 0.4, and for tenure, ESG, and busyness is going to be 2.2 each. So what we find is that firms with companies with low female on the board, they will receive more complaint on board diversity in their rationale. And we find similar patterns for independence, tenure, busyness, and CEO duality, suggesting that rationales portray an accurate picture of companies' governance weaknesses. And this also suggests that institutional investors cast informed vote, despite concerns about their incentives to exert enough governance. So now we know rationales contain some information about companies, and now we study whether they are consistent with, rationales are consistent with the voting behavior. And we find that there's some connection between the stated rationale and voting behavior. And moving on to the final question of whether there are any consequences of rationale. So we find that companies seem to address concern in stated voting rationale. So when there's more rationale related to board diversity, the effect of dissent voting on board gender diversity becomes stronger in the following year. And this is not just happening because these are the firms with higher fraction of females. And lastly, we show that when all of the concerns in rationales are addressed, the average dissent decreases by about 0.6 to 2% in the following year. So I guess I'm out of time, so let me just put up this slide. And thank you very much, everyone. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhala, for the discussion.
Thank you again to the organizers, FAE, for inviting me to discuss this nice paper. So let me just give you a quick overview of the paper and its main findings, and then I have basically two categories of comments for the authors, which I will go over. So the paper gets textual data on voting rationales provided by institutional investors. It uses NLP to extract rationales to sort out the text. And then the questions then follow. What rationales do we see in the expressed? Are the rationales rational? They make sense. Then do the firms respond to the stated rationales? Do they say something about it? And the last question is that do the rationales reduce future, do the responses generate less dissent? So overall assessment, I thought that the data set was interesting, the topic is interesting, and the methods are completely reasonable. The econometric specifications actually are interesting. They're very far from run-of-the-mill. They had to work very hard to construct models that speak to the questions that they want to get to. So I thought that was a novel one. I thought that the approach towards rational washing, which is you just copy whatever ISS and says, their approach was very nice. You look at the vote, people who vote exactly what the way ISS does, look at their rationales, and that is basically whatever ISS has. So I thought that was quite clever. And I think overall, as a description, the paper works quite nicely. A couple of issues, one is that with the people who give rationales are single digit over here. Okay, so it's a small fraction. It's very difficult to get causal statements or get some structure to fit, structural models. So I don't know what the larger policy prescriptions that jump out of this are. Do you want people to disclose more rationales? Not disclose? How should they be disclosing? I don't know what exactly we get out of this, and the economic implications remain open. The other issue is that there's another paper, which Irene just told me was in the same session as theirs in MFA, that is floating around, and that has marginally different conclusions, and so that needs to, I think both of them need to sort each other out. So, the paper has about 780,000 voting rationales. Some 1,500 of them are used for training, and what you find is rationales are more likely when you have something nasty to say about the managers, which is fine. And the main ones Irene pointed out was independence, diversity, tenure, business, and ESG and climate comes low down in this. And the peculiar thing is the competitor paper sort of argues that climate and ESG are important. So, that's why I'm saying that these papers need to coordinate each other. So the votes do not reflect the ISS and Glass-Lewis recommendations, and they do it in a nice way. So there are a bunch of tests over here, which I will quickly go through. The vote rationales reflect both characteristics. So for example, if you're saying that I don't like diversity, you're likely to see this happen in the less diverse boards. the voting behavior is consistent with rational. So in the sense that the way what you express is the way exactly you vote. So that is fine. The firms respond to whatever rationals that they see, and the future descent decreases. Now this part I thought, I was just curious over here. What they do over here is you look at whether future descent comes down when the companies address what the concerns are. I was wondering whether there's some room for an IV over here because rationals can be used as an instrument for what issues they seek to address. But that's a small sort of point out here. So my comments, I have two sets of comments, and this is the first one of them. About 5.6 of votes have rationals, and or voters have rationals, and the selection issue is very stark. Who kind of gives rationals and who doesn't give rationals? Then it's increasing over time. Why? I think it makes sense, but why? Is it increasing? What is the pressure to increase? The paper, I mean, here the question is interesting because are more complex issues coming to boards, and therefore you need to explain your stances more? Are more against votes coming, and so you need to explain them more? Are you going more against recommendations, and that's why you need to explain more? I think, some color on that would be very useful. The paper asks basically in a nutshell what rationals are provided. But I think the interesting question is why provide rationals? Why do you want to go about doing it? Because rationals take time and effort, right? Anybody who asks me to write an explanation, it takes a lot of time. Students ask me to write, why do you give me this grade? It takes time, I don't want to do it. And referees ask you to write rationals for why you did this. That also takes time. But so why do you want to do all this, So what are the benefits? And so one possibility maybe, what is the economic model? One is that rationals may trigger herding to your preferred position. In which case, then you want to say, what are the timelines for release of rationals? When do they come out? And who else can see them? And does that trigger some sort of coordination? Is it a coordination mechanism? So I think some economic model, at least thinking behind this, would, I think, enrich the paper. Some more possibilities for investigating it empirically. You can look within the text. Why am I giving the rationale? So that part, not what rationale I'm giving. You can look at that. And then you can look at how many votes against don't provide rationals and why, they don't do that. And then, when the paper focuses on director voting and rationals given for that, are they voting correlated with other voting rationals? So for example, there may be proposals in a proxy statements and maybe you're giving rationals for them also. And so these are some sort of directions on why you want to give these things. Because once I start writing a rationale for one of these votes, then maybe it's easier to put the same thing in other places. And so that might be one sort of explanation. I think one of the other things is that in the time series, why do some institutions first begin to give rationales? This is an interesting question given that it's not mandated. And the paper discusses, the hazards that once you start, you continue doing the same thing again and again with 82% next year. But 82%, over 2 or 3 years begins to shrink quite quickly. So what is exactly this 82% and how does the time series go? I think it might be might be interesting. And similarly in the cross-section, right? Do you give it for all the companies? Do you not give it for all the companies? Or is it just voting against? And so I think, again, the color is not there. So I think also that the extensive margin, the extensive margin is which I am focusing on when to provide a rationale is also endogenous. And so there's a selection effect over here that raises an econometric issue. I think the economic issue is more interesting than the econometric issue, but given that selection has been around for 30, 40 years in our profession, you need to say something over here. So I think the question is why you give a rationale in the first place is standing out, and I think some progress on that might be useful. I also thought that the second item, and this is basically the second major item, is that it focuses on director elections, which is reasonable. It's a major item. I thought that it might be useful to do a little bit more at the director level. Is there something about the director that leads to rationals? And some examples, director characteristics come to mind. Demographics, which directors, tenure, background, connection, what role the director has on the board. Is it the lead director or not? Does that lead to rationals? one director can serve in multiple boards, and then so therefore is there some variation on the same director getting rationales across multiple companies on or not? And the other thing with director elections is who comes up for election is kind of according to a slate, right? The directors typically rotate out, and it may be interesting. And I'm wondering whether the director elections are basically a shoulder to use a gun to shoot at the firm. Is that why is going on? And so I think more on the director level, I think would kind of enrich the paper. This is the last item that I have to say. The paper has direct data from multiple countries, and there might be different regulations on whether the rationales must be given. And the paper is blank on that. I thought it might be useful to look at that. There are a couple of things that the paper talks about. What does not come in rationales? And two of the things that come up are director performance and director skills. But I think these kinds of things, I think the explanation for that is that these are more important when you're appointing directors, not voting against them, whether they have skills or not. Sometimes, of course, if the company is changing a lot and you feel that some issues are becoming important, you may bring it up. But by and large, these are appointment level issues. I thought that the last point over here, the use of BERT is quite cool for these rationales. And the work is state of art. I don't have any issues with that. But I thought that the endogeneity and missing variable issues are not gone just because you use BERT over here. The simpler things like length, complexity, linguistic richness of text, the tone, the sentiment, the litigiousness, all of these things may matter, especially when you look at future dissent, right? If I write a very nasty remark in one year, then maybe the dissent, the firms might respond better. So there might be clever ways of massaging these things to make some causal statements using, or at least get into heterogeneity. I think it might give more color and more credibility in the fact that rationales matter. I think all these are important, especially because so few companies disclose, so few institutions disclose rationales. Let me stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for really thoughtful discussion. So all points are very well taken. To respond to some of the points, so regarding the competing paper, yes, we are well aware of this paper, and then they're actually trying to use the data on rationale as a robustness check, and then so that our paper can be more about the rationale and their paper can be more about diversity and ESG. And I guess like their paper is showing that ESG is having an impact on the director election vote. However, when we see the figure, I think the relative importance is still small. And regarding the selection issue, yes, we are working with a very endogenous data. This is like a voluntary disclosure, and then you can write whatever you want to write. So I guess, yeah, we are aware of this issue. And I think, so I guess all of our conclusion that we make, like because like our data like covers like more than 80% of like firms like have rationale. So I guess although the decision to provide rationales are very selective, we have pretty much all the like firms and proposal in our sample. And then if you have any specific like concerns about how like these like selection issue can change the interpretation of our concern, I think we're really like excited to explore this. But we don't see that like firms with like more like poor performance are more likely to attract rationale. So I guess to the extent that the results are not affected by deselection, I think, but we're willing to hear more about this. And then regarding the points on like who gives rationale, like this is a really important point, and why you give rationale. So at some point we're trying to write like a different paper on, like another paper on this, but we thought this would not be scope of this paper. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. So you solicited proposals about why do they write rationales. I think that's actually the most like a one unifying or organizing principle to all the great comments in the discussion. is if we only have rationales for 5% of the vote, we need to figure out the cost of giving rationales. And I think there's a huge difference between rationales that are less costly to write and rationales that are more costly to write. So if I'm an institutional investor and I'm adopting a certain policy about diversity or independence, that's like something that I can run across the board, across all firms, kind of a one-size-fits-all. I'm for diversity, I'm for independence, or something like that. And it's very easy to write these rationales. Now, you never see rationales about specific skills because skills are firm-specific. Even if I have, as an institutional investor, a good rationale for why I vote against this director or for this director, it will be costlier for me to provide this rationale because it's very director-specific or firm-specific. So to me, that's kind of, once we think about it that way, it somewhat answers many of the comments in the discussions.
Yep. Yep. Great point. Yep. Thank you for your comments. Yeah.
Hi. Full disclosure, I used to write comments. I was in the voting team at Fidelity Investments, and then I was in the Chief Policy Officer at Glass Lewis. So I'm familiar with that. It's actually pretty easy. You make your voting decision. There's a drop-down box, vote against director because of lack of independence. So it goes part and parcel with making the voting decision. Secondly, the investors who are clients of the Fidelities want their rationale for their reporting. So the big investors will write their rationale to explain to their clients why they're making their voting decision, as well as if the SEC comes calling and they want to audit their voting. But I was actually very curious as to what busyness means. I've never heard that term before. And also how you determine who's a robo-voter.
Okay, so regarding busyness, it's about whether you hold like more than like certain number of director positions. So that's what we mean by busyness. And then I guess you're not capturing that because like Glass Lewis is not frequently used in class. Yeah. The same thing. And then second question.
Oh, how did you determine who is a robo-voter?
Oh, so we look at the cosine similarity of the rationales, and then so by looking at first the robo-voters who vote with ISS or Glass Lewis like more than 99% of the time, and then we look at the cosine similarity of their rationale, and it is like 0.96 for ISS robo-voters and 0.99 for Glass Lewis robo-voters. So it's pretty much giving us the evidence that this is the ISS and Glass Lewis rationale.
I'd love to talk to you about this. And maybe more insight.
Yep, yeah, would love that. Yeah.
More question?
So my question is, can you also see what type of institutions provide more votings? You can also look at it that way because like maybe there are some intrinsic like characteristics for some institutions that they do provide more votings or more rationals.
Yes. Yes. So we see that Germany is requiring their like institutional investors to disclose. So we see a high fraction of rationale for them, and then we see that European investors are much more likely to disclose rationale compared to U.S. investors. So their rationales are a little bit overrepresented. And then when we do the propensity score like weighting, we try to give more weight to the U.S. investors by like adjusting the proportion of rationales in the sample. Yeah.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was planning to talk about that at the break, but given EK just came out. So in many of these European Union countries, actually, because of a set of directives within the European Union, institutional investors are required to provide information and rationales for this type of votes. So that's why I was also wondering, I mean, in that case, it seems like a situation where an investor like Deutsche Bundesbank or somebody like that would do that mostly to comply with their internal regulation and also to kind of speak to their own kind of investors and shareholders in the home country more than potentially trying to have an effect on whatever is happening here in the US. So how should we think about those different motivations for providing rationales?
So yeah, I would say that like different motivations are all like coming together. I think like they would try to communicate with companies. That's one reason. They would try to communicate with clients. That's another reason. And then because they're like some of them are like PRI signatories, like they would also want to like comply with the PRI. So these like all like reasons are all playing together. I wouldn't think that like we can separate out like by looking at like these each institutional investor's pattern. But however, we see that like European institutional investors, like because they have this regulation, they're much more likely to provide rationales.
So I have a question for both you and also Bob. That is, why don't institutional investors provide voting rationales, especially when they vote against the company's director nominees?
I guess it's gonna be costly to disclose rationale for because like we have like some of the institutional investors vote on more than 100,000 proposals. So even like even if they have to disclose all for votes against, it's gonna be a substantial fraction. So it's gonna be costly to disclose for all. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the most part, the votes are consistent with the guidelines, so they would generally point the companies back to the guidelines, like the board isn't 75% independent, so we're going to vote against 1 or 2 members. They will report to the companies. There's a lot of engagement between investors and companies, so they might, like when I was at Fidelity, if we were going to vote against a company and we own more than 1%, we would call and explain why. So that's where the rationale actually gets communicated to the company. And ideally, it would be a negotiation where the company would agree to make some changes, even post-meeting, that allow the investor to make their decision. But in terms of the rationale, they don't see it as a big value add, I would say. And for the votes for, you're basically saying vote for unless, so you're not going to go for each individual director voting for, like vote for, we like, and vote for, So it's more like, what are the outliers, who are when we vote against, and it's a very generic, initially, reason for vote against, so they can track how many. So if we are voting against a lot of directors for lack of independence, maybe we reevaluate our independence standard or that particular provision. So it's as much for reporting to clients, some internal purposes, but it's really not robust because it really isn't kind of worth the effort.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the presentation, the discussants, and of course for the discussion, the questions and the answers. And now we're